I noticed something unusual in my comments section. When we have been talking about boarding actions or crusade rules, someone may comment, "Wow, those rules sound rubbish." And someone who likes the game mode may comment, "Oh, I really like it, it suits my way of playing. Do you prefer more tournament style play?" Hang on, what is this? Since when was the internet this kind? I have seen comments on other 40k YouTubers' channels. It is insults and vitriol that people are doing it wrong because they use different official rulebooks. Why is it my comment section? Is there something wrong with me? So while the polite comments went back and forth saying, "Yeah, I prefer more tournament style play, I don't have to think about doing terrain unfairly, but your thing sounds cool for memorable stories," I have to fix this. So I trolled the comments and found the thing that might generate some of that juicy YouTube engagement. Base size. When talking about proxy models or using one cool Games Workshop model as another one, someone will ask if using a Space Marine Sergeant with a big sword as a captain is okay, or using an Age of Sigmar model as a chaplain, and the answer will be, yes, of course, as long as it's on the correct base. Ho. Well, it isn't meant with that level of anger, but it's an odd hang-up to have considering how we are okay with using different models from different Games Workshop systems, or from any other wargame entirely. At one point, the majority of players I knew used the much cheaper and nicer Kings of War zombies over the Vampire Count zombies. But the base size thing, it bothered me for so many reasons. We should be okay with base sizes not having exact measurements. That is what I plan to explain in this video, even though a lot of you have already left comments with your opinion based on the title alone. I can tell, if it's a 25-minute video and I see comments appear after 5 minutes, I know you didn't watch it. There is no 5 times speed at which I am comprehensible. And I am curious to read the comments on this video, especially the comments that agree with me. And I have so many reasons for this belief, but first we need to go into why it is this way. Why the collective 40k community decided that base size is important. Age of Sigmar came out. Warhammer Fantasy models on square bases were not quite right for the new Age of Sigmar, which used circle bases. So if you wanted to play Age of Sigmar, the general feeling was a 20mm square base isn't doing the same job as a 25mm circle base, even though the corners are about the same distance as a circle base anyway. Space Marines! Primaris Space Marines came out, and all of the Space Marines began to be sold with 32mm bases instead of the previous 25mm bases. It could be a tactical squad, it could be a Primaris Intercessor, one of them squads. They were on 32mm bases now. Then it slowly happened to Orcs and Gene Stealers. The new models came on bigger bases, or the old kits started to be sold with bigger bases. So there was a great debate. Do you rebase? Do you cut the model off the old base, put them onto a new one, or do you get a funny slotter thing that the model goes into so that it extends a 25mm base to a 32mm base and then it matches the bigger base size? But it looks odd that you have nice grass on the base, but it then ends on a big red bit of plastic. So do you rebase to keep with the times? Apparently the consensus of the community was yes, which gives us the current attitude. If there was a big debate over it, then surely it must matter. The advice from Games Workshop at the time was, use the base it is on. If you need to have a larger size, just act as if it was on a slightly larger base. Continue to use the power of imagination while you imagine the stabbing and the shooting that the dice represent. When and why can base size matter? Base sizes can affect combat a tiny bit. You can have more models fight if you have smaller bases. But if you have larger bases, you can reach more enemy units with a charge and still be in coherency. And there is the wall block exploit that I do so hate, where you can be so far from a wall to prevent enemy bases being next to your model, so completing a successful charge, and not be clipping through a wall. It stops interaction with charges, as if the best part of a war game is the siege, but only the part where you stand outside the walls and do nothing, not the escalade charge part of it. If you play the Games Workshop Tournament FAQ, rules guidance on it is not found alongside the core rules, just for tournaments, then it is allowed. But I feel this is like the Penitent Host. A problem with the wording meant that you had to choose a vow. Games Workshop explained how it worked as written, and then changed it at the next rules update. Games Workshop had tried to fix the uninteractive walls at events before, briefly, by adding 2 extra inches to the charge rolls, so you could get around the ruin even if you couldn't go through it. But if the wall wasn't a problem for that charge, it was just free extra charge distance. I don't think it's a good situation, and it has to be resolved in favour of the charger, otherwise you can make a charge impossible. If there was an easy fix Games Workshop could do that didn't lead to many more pages of an FAQ, they would have done it. In this situation, a 1-inch gap to be 1 inch from the wall so that enemies just on the other side can't be in engagement range and complete a charge, the space there can fit a 25mm base. So small bases are better, but you could include the depth of the wall as well to be 24.9mm or 24.8mm away from the wall. Potentially, it stops it. But if you are screening out enemies from deep strike or blocking their movement by being in the way or projecting a bigger aura, bigger bases are better. Being spread out with your unit coherency, you cover a larger area. If you are disembarking from a transport, your units need to be wholly within 3 inches of the transport. That would be 2 ranks for 32mm bases, 3 ranks for 25mm bases. You can stack up in one area and then charge with more of them in one direction, or be out of line of sight from a different angle. In 10th edition, there are a lot more models on the table. The points per model stayed about the same from 9th edition to 10th edition, but war gear became free. A unit that was 110 points plus another 45 points for extra weapons is now 110 points, not 155. I expect the sales team are quite happy with this, but there is less space on the table. 2,000 points can be packed. Having smaller bases makes gameplay a bit easier. Some gaps in terrain may exist that bigger bases cannot fit through. Ideally, your terrain should accommodate the largest bases so that they can move around most of the board, but potentially 25mm infantry could escape through a narrow alleyway that 32 or 40mm infantry could not. And if their models are normally on the other kind of base, or they're sold on that, then it affects which gaps they can fit in. There are some potential gains, some potential drawbacks which really shouldn't matter outside of the 1 in 100 times game where measuring is down to the millimeter and it makes any kind of game difference. If you can think of more situations where base size matters, let me know in the comments. I believe it shouldn't matter. If you're playing by intent with the base sizes, to use the current base size, or you can use the base the model has, instead of imagining it to be bigger, usually bigger. It's better to use the base you can see, then you don't have to do more measuring, think, that enemy unit is 8.1 inches away, but the base should be 7mm bigger, so actually I need to roll a 7, not an 8 to make the charge roll. That's extra thinking and measuring you need to do. Just use the base as is. They can't have travelled further by having a bigger base. Being right up to the edge of your deployment zone, it doesn't matter what size it is. They're travelling the same distance. So you can move some front models in a unit precisely, and then you can push the back models in a clump to save time instead of measuring each individual model. The unit will be the same distance from the enemy if you hadn't done that. A 25mm base 9 inches away is the same as a 40mm base 9 inches away. The base is part of the model, but we don't usually use bases for line of sight. We use the model. A 25mm base is the same height up as a 32mm base. If a model is leaning forward over their base, it is easier to shoot than one crouching on its base. So base size doesn't matter again. It's based on the... I can't say based. It is because of the pose of the model. Otherwise, if I kept saying based, it's all based. Orcs and pure strain gene stealers are overextending their old 25mm bases anyway. The base is a very minor part of the model. And when building models, you can use the proper base, but don't be stupid with it. These Eldar flyers are on the correct base size, but are glued differently to what most players have. That is modeling for advantage. The base plays no part in that modeling. Don't make me rebase my metal sisters from 25mm to 32mm. Aside from unnecessary expense to buy more bases, the slaughter bases have very big contact points to help keep the model on the base. You would have to cut that off and rely on 2 thin bits of the metal feet to hold the metal model on its new plastic base. The plastic battle sisters break too often. Don't put the metal sisters in the same position. It is mean to expect people to pay and modify their models just to keep up with Games Workshop's expectation of what is normal. And it can look ugly if you do that. Old possessed models don't suit the bigger base they're on. Heavy weapons teams for the Imperial Guard that were on 60mm bases do not look good on the smaller bases the new models are sold on. Base size isn't one way. We can't think that, oh, a base should be bigger. Base sizes can be smaller. They go down as well as up. If you have the older, large metal penitent engine on a 60mm base, are you going to put it on a 50mm base to represent the newer, smaller plastic penitent engine? It is a different visual profile for shooting at it, so it already has some game impact compared to the plastic models. Does base size matter that much? Or are you expected to discard your old model and buy a newer one? I think that might be Games Workshop's hope. If you cleave to the mantra of current base size is best for any model, that is an extra step in the way of making all the sisters characters you need from an Novitiate set, which has been suggested before by incredibly smart and sexy people. We don't use templates in 40k anymore. No flame templates, no blast templates, so you're not avoiding more damage by having hordes of orc boys on larger 32mm instead of the previous 25mm. I think you should use the base sizes you want, within reason. What looks right for fitting the model on a stand without too much space between them and the edge. You wouldn't want to get silly with base sizes and use a base 10 or 20mm larger than the models around it. That wouldn't look okay. Except Games Workshop does that! The Hospitaller is on a 50mm base in a unit of Battle Sisters that come with 32mm bases. What is happening? Newer Battle Sister infantry models like the Repentia and the Novitiates are on 28.5mm bases. The Battle Sisters that are the same size and aren't swinging around a massive chainsword are on 32mm bases. It is almost like Games Workshop doesn't care about standardized base sizes. So my next point is, Games Workshop doesn't care about standardized base sizes. With Warhammer Fantasy Battles: The Old World, so even older than the timeline of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, there are base sizes recommended on the unit page. Kill Team has base sizes and an FAQ that changes the base size. Can you keep up with that? But there is no base size list or recommended sizes for models in 40k. Wikipedia has base size listed, but that is not the official rules. The Games Workshop web store tells you what bases come in the box, but that is not a rules site. And then the Repentia come with 10 28.5mm bases and a 32mm base. It doesn't tell you just from that the Superior should be on the 32mm base. You could put her on 28.5. It comes with that base in the box. When we get to tournaments, casual tournaments run by local clubs almost always say, use the base that the model was sold with. If you bought the Black Reach starter set with Orcs and Marines on 25mm bases, use that size base for those models. If you converted 5 Hachette Combat Patrol Terminators to be Assault Terminators with Lightning Claws, a very cool thing to do, you would use the 50mm base the models came with. The ITC has a chart of bases that they use. For fairness, they have a list to make it less of an issue and not as vague or hypothetically abusable than what it came on or what it was sold on in a set time frame. Yet Games Workshop has changed their stance for their tournaments. They no longer say, use whatever base the model came on. They now expect you to use the base size of the models they currently sell. Check their webpage for the current base size. This even happens at their supposedly less competitive narrative events or events for under 16s. Believe me that this expectation from Games Workshop that you use the base size of a model as it's currently sold is just a marketing thing to sell bits, like basing kits. It is a change in their stance to expect it even at narrative events, but remember that this only applies to Games Workshop tournaments. Games Workshop is daft to expect that they can enforce that rule beyond the events they control. We will come back to this. But sadly among the community, the commenters perhaps, there is too much belief that base size is an integral, intended part of the rules. And when that happens, I just quote back part of their comment, ... Games Workshop has balanced 40k ... And that is usually enough for them to understand the error they just made. When Games Workshop wrote the rules, they paid base size so little attention. It is not mentioned in the unit rules, and two models sold on very different base sizes could have basically the same rules and points. Like the Catan. The Deceiver is on a 40mm base. It is not resold or reboxed to be on a larger one. The Transcendent Catan is on a 60mm base. Their profile is the same, essentially the same. There are 5 points between the 40mm Nightbringer and the 80mm based Void Dragon. They are basically the same. But what the flippity flip is happening with aircraft? As an aircraft, it has a base. It is a vehicle or monster, and you measure from the hull, which should be about 4 inches up. Yet only part of it will protrude over the base that you can't climb on to reach it. You can move over the base, but you can't end on the base. So it has this really weird existence where the base can matter, except when it doesn't even exist, despite being there on the table. When it comes to monsters and vehicles that have bases or don't have bases, it is basically the same if you have a base or don't have a base and you're partly within or out of a ruin, which is a whole confusing thing. Terrain rules, generally, are a mess this edition. What if you wanted to do a thing that so many people do and play past editions of 40k? I have been told that if I don't like 10th edition, even though I do, I should go back to playing older editions, which I also do. 4th edition is really popular and is compatible with supplements from 3rd edition like the Eye of Terror campaign and any books from 5th edition. If you liked a Horus Heresy mission in a mission book, you could play that with Eldar and Tyranids using the 6th edition rules. Do you then rebase your models to be compatible with those editions? Or do you have spare extra models just to play those editions but not the most recent editions, even though Legends rules exist to let you play the recent edition with those older units? If base size matters, why would only the current edition be considered sacrosanct for base size and balance? Haven't you all taken your Beastman Ungors, cut them off the square base, put them on circle bases for Age of Sigmar, then cut them off those bases and put them back on a different square base to play Old World? Of course you've all done that. Now here is an image that would cause much pearl clutching and dropped glasses. This is one of my Seraphim on a 25mm base. I can play whatever edition I want. Ooh, are you going to insist that I couldn't use that model? Do you care a lot about it? Please? Please somebody care. I had the most profound thought. Only when 10th edition is over will you be able to properly play 10th edition. Only then will the rules be complete, no longer changed. Only then will the rulebook be done. And presumably all the codex is out. There are people who still play 9th edition who now have all of the rules and don't fancy moving on to 10th edition. So what is the correct base size for units in 10th edition? The new plastic warp spiders are on 28.5mm bases. But hypothetically, if there was no change in their rules or points, surely it is okay to keep using the 25mm bases. Or are all the Tau players with Vespids changing their older Vespid models to 28.5 instead of 25mm? I very much doubt it, nor should we expect them to change. And I assume that every Tyranid player who had an army before 10th edition has of course bought dozens of 28mm bases to rebase all of their gaunts from the old 25mm bases. What is with the units that have different base sizes within the unit? Surely that isn't for gameplay reasons and is to make sure the model doesn't fall over. That's what I think the intended purpose of a base is. So the Neophyte Hybrid Heavy Weapons are on a 32mm base, but the other Neophytes in the same squad are on 25mm bases. Repentia have a Superior on a 32mm base, while the ladies swinging massive chainswords around are on 28.5mm. And what about heavy weapon squads for the Imperial Guard? There are 3 kinds now, and despite essentially being the same, they have different base sizes. The older Catachan heavy weapons are on 60mm bases, the Cadians are on 50mm bases, and the Death Corps of Krieg look to be on 50mm but with an extra 25mm man. Are they on different base size for distinctly important gameplay reasons? If you had 3 of the new Lascannon heavy weapon teams on their 50mm bases, and called them Catachans to get the rerolls, is that mega cheating? Is that breaking the game? Would that be a blight in the eye of the gods? Would you rebase them before you permitted yourself to consider using more appropriate rules? But I'm not going to talk about the 25mm missile launcher teams and the weedy heavy bolters that don't have bases. I'm sure that, oh, look, this guy has a Space Marine Lieutenant on a 32mm base instead of a 40mm base. See? No one cares. Does Games Workshop care? Games Workshop doesn't really care about the games you play, the games you should be playing for fun. They go even further than inconsistent base sizes. Loads of their models don't even have bases. Look at this awesome church organ tank. No base. Its greatness has transcended the concept of a base. But if you have an older Immolator model from 2nd edition, that is just as legal in play as the newer one, but Games Workshop doesn't expect you to pad it out to be the size of the more recent model. They want you to buy the more recent model, but stating it would be too barefaced even for them. What about the Defiler? Where do you measure from? Its spikes? If you are partly under its front claws, you are in engagement range from a vertical distance, but that looks wrong. If you pose the front claws down, then you have a different distance to engagement range. Is that allowed? Are you allowed to add a base to it? Is that okay? Games Workshop has shown off Deathwatch tanks with added bases, which is changing the set of rules they operate on for vehicles. Now you measure from the base, not the hull. But Games Workshop must be okay with it to show the models off. If you think base size is very important, I believe you're trying to impose some sort of pattern or great plan, some sense of order where there is none. It shouldn't matter. It was never meant to matter. Play with your little toys on bases that the model fits on. If it needs a bigger base to fit a cool diorama, great! No, you can't have all your Gretchen on 120mm oval bases to block enemy movement. Why are you specifically like this? No, don't delete the comment. Leave it there and people will then comment based as a funny pun. Just do not be that guy who acts in bad faith to try and get some minor edge in the game. It is not the only thing that guy has done. You can check out... You thought this was the end of the video. Now, from my statistics, maybe 45% of people will watch this far, so not all of you get to know the secret, but there's another part to consider. What if there is a plan behind it? A Games Workshop plan? Not for game design, but for money! If you have to rebase, where can everyone think of off the top of their head that sells bases of the correct height and diameter? Games Workshop. Then you engage with the hobby. Then maybe you want more models or buy something else along with the bases, or because they are there on the shelf, you buy newer versions of your models. I read the opening of the 9th edition rulebook. It came out 5 years ago and opens with this great tone setter of having fun, making what you want, using the rules you want, but by the end of 9th edition and 10th edition came around, that was not the tone. So much of Games Workshop is about competitive play. Boarding actions and combat patrol don't see core rules updates. Tournament plays add-on FAQ sees updates often. If there are rules changes and points changes, that is done in the context of tournament games, not crusade games. Games Workshop's rule changes are for tournaments. Their store sales are basic rules for casual players, or more specifically, the parents of potentially interested casual children players who may be wanting to buy some cool models. So what about those models that go on the base? It seems like the shooting rules are not taking their cue from bases, but from the models themselves. That means you have a harder time in a competitive setting being able to justify proxy models or kit bashes or conversions, or even an alternate pose to the one you see on the box. If a gun sticks out or a tail sticks out, or any part of a weapon, you can fire every weapon on the model from that protrusion. So the only way to make it fair, not balanced by any means, but fair under the rules, is to make everyone buy models from Games Workshop and make everyone build them in exactly the same monopose way. Follow the box art. If you haven't built your models in that way, you may have to buy another one or suffer a penalty to attend one of the London events. If you didn't like the flight stand of the Seraphim and made your own that don't have the Seraphim up so high, you are messing with the game balance now, just in a very minor way that only affects line of sight in unusual cases. If a rule seems inconsistently applied, money and product could be the reason why. Games Workshop is not making a game from scratch. They update the rules for each new edition, mostly taking the previous edition with them for all of the models from those past editions. We know in 10th edition they don't seem to like aircraft or fortifications, and only sometimes tolerate towering units. But because all of those are part of the range that Games Workshop wants to sell, there has to be some rules for including them. So base size doesn't matter, except the few times when it does. But it shouldn't. But it sort of might. But it won't. That's the thesis of this video. Maybe if shooting attacks were all measured base to base, then base size would mean something, even outside of the most sterilized, made bland but fair tournament setting. But that is not how shooting attacks work in 40k. They're a whole weird thing unto themselves. You must learn, you must be educated, you must subscribe, and you must have a great day of 40k.